Hi, everybody. I'm going to give people 1 more minute to join because I see the numbers still going up. And then we'll start. All right, welcome everybody. I'm really excited to start this, what I call season 2 of the CAFIN and UC Investments webinar series, speaker series. So this season, this academic year, we're focusing on the interplay between environmental, social, and governance sustainable goals and financial system. And today we have Myers Jaffe to talk about sustainable investment, and her talk will be moderated by Jagdeep Bashar, who is the Chief Investment Officer of the University of California. And they together wrote a sustainable investment framework many years ago. So they're both at the forefront of the thinking in how financial system can help us combat climate change. Jagdeep, can you turn on your camera so people can see you? So I'm going to pass the microphone to Jagdeep. Thank you so much for moderating today's talk.
Thank you, Galina. Good morning to everybody. I see our numbers are climbing and we really appreciate everyone joining us on a Friday morning. Let's see, let's have Amy turn her camera on too. And I typically would read you a long bio of a friend of mine, Myers Jaffe, and I'm not going to do that today. What I will tell you is the following. In 2014, I stumbled across a brochure from UC Davis that had Amy's picture on it. I didn't know Amy. And over the course of the next few weeks, when I got a chance to meet Amy at the campus at UC Davis, we got into a conversation about climate change and ESG, which back then seemed like a complicated acronym and was complicated to unpack. Now, Amy, between 2014 and today, we spent some time working together, but you've done some phenomenal things in the last 7 years. So instead of me introducing you, could you give us a sense of the journey you've had since that first meeting we had at that falafel stand in UC Davis?
Well, it's actually been quite the journey because when Jagdeep met me, I was trying to help the state of California come up with better pathways for the energy industry to comply with what's called the low carbon fuel standard, which is a regulation in California that requires producers of fuel, gasoline and diesel basically, to provide an increasing level of low carbon fuel. And there was a lot of acrimony at the time about this law. And so I was working on that, and Jagdeep came to me. I was a professor at the business school at Davis, because he wanted to talk about climate risk. And I was explaining to him how Europe had this very forward approach to thinking about how to stress test their portfolios on climate risk. And we sort of started to think about some of the tools that were out there were really not adequate. And we started thinking about how would we do it if we were going to create a system from scratch? What would be the best way of doing that? And we worked on looking at sort of best practice from the academic literature, best practice from other financial institutions, and I think came up with a pretty revolutionary approach, because at the time, many funds and financial institutions were just thinking about public equity. So, you know, should they still be owning a stock in Peabody Energy, or should they still be owning ExxonMobil stock? And they weren't thinking about their whole of, with Biden, whole of government, their whole of portfolio approach, thinking about the risks that might come to real assets, which are investments that can last over a decade, and thinking about the bond market and what was happening in fixed income, and also thinking about real estate investment and other sort of hardcore investments that broad portfolios include. And each rabbit hole we would go down would provide new insights, not only about what one might want to avoid in investing, but unbelievably new opportunities to invest in things that were going to be very valuable going forward in an energy transition world. And so
then you told me you were leaving our
what?
Yes, and that was kind of like a sad day. It's like, I don't get to spend all this time debating this with you. But you took on what you told me back then was your dream job.
I did, because I always wanted to write a book, which you can see in my backdrop, Energy's Digital Future. So I wrote this book sitting at the Council of Foreign Relations, looking at how revolutionary digital technology, so things like automation, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, was going to affect this question of climate change and climate risk. And I had a study group that involved people from Silicon Valley and others helped me. We did some tours of new technology companies. And so book is published. I miss my students, so I'm now a professor at Tufts, and I am the managing director of their premier institution called the Climate Policy Lab, which is a center that helps governments from around the world fashion better climate policies, both on adaptation and mitigation of carbon. And I'm still writing about the impact of climate change on financial markets, and indeed have an article coming out soon in Nature Energy about the disclosure system and how to make it a hybrid system that would work not only in the United States, but globally. So it has been a journey.
Fabulous. So as all of you can see, Amy has a breadth of knowledge around this topic well before it became fashionable. And what she has not mentioned is she started out her career in oil and gas, just like I moved here from Alberta. And so both of us would be the last people to have this change of culture, so to speak, considering the past, if you just looked at our bios, but we've adopted a new religion. And so I'm really excited for you to share your insights today. And I'm going to get into a Q&A with you, of course, at some point, and the audience is going to be very active as well. But why don't I pass it to you to set the stage for us and give us the wisdom of all these years of learning and what your current thinking is today around climate change, and frame it for us to begin the conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen for about 5 minutes because I have found that many of you listening, maybe your institutions have pledged net zero by 2050. Maybe you're hearing governments talking about, as the Glasgow global climate meetings come forward, are hearing about, net zero for 2050. And I find that people think they know what they're saying, but when you go down into the weeds, there's a lot of confusion actually about net zero. Now, hold on a second. There we go. So I'm just going to put a few slides here so that I can really make sure that as we're talking about this issue of climate risk, that we're really all on the same page with the same vocabulary. So we all know that the latest IPCC ARC6 report released this summer was unequivocal about the human contribution to climate change. And scientists are in agreement that the world must reach net zero global carbon emissions by 2050 and then move to net negative global emissions to be able to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Jagdeep and I used to spend a lot of time talking about the physical aspects of climate risk. So not just the mitigation, energy transition part, but what happens when a location has flooding, or there's a heat wave, or fires, or drought. And this summer, raging into now September, we've seen all kinds of disruptions all around the world. We have the whole electricity system in China was thrown off by a drought that knocked off hydroelectric, which caused them to have to move their production of polysilicon to another province. We've seen in Britain less wind than was expected, combined with a disruption of the connector that brings French nuclear power. And so we are seeing giant energy shortages and rising natural gas prices and other effects in Europe, also a little geopolitical given the lack of increase of supply from Russia. And here in the United States, we've seen energy get disrupted by severe weather this past summer, and of course, a very serious heat wave. So when we think about net zero, you know, there are a lot of companies who've announced net zero, and I know from talking to some of them, they're not really understanding the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. So I have this nice slide here. And really the bottom line is that, you know, companies understand that they need to move their emissions to the lowest possible level and try to eliminate, you know, switching to renewable energy, to energy efficiency, process efficiency, and so forth. But, you know, what I think is not well understood is that buying offsets for CO2 is not part of the net zero equation. What is part of the net zero equation is to actually invest in removals of carbon from the atmosphere. And that technology is not well understood. Microsoft just published an article where they explained how difficult it is to do. They are actually have the ambition to remove their historical emissions and not just their current, going negative on their current profile. They actually are looking to offset their historical emissions by eventually getting to a high level of removals. And they put out a bid to do that. And what they found was that the science of removals is shifting. We're now understanding that reforestation is not as effective a tool as was thought in the past. And one can think about fire and changing growth patterns through drought and higher insect beetles and others things that are attacking forest land is making the maintenance of forest land harder than it was. And Microsoft put out this bid for suppliers to provide them with investments, future investments in negative emissions. And what they found was 95% of them were less durable nature-based solutions. And there's a very small number of technology options that were given them that were really substantial carbon removals, either through direct air capture companies that are literally have machinery that's taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, or the more commonly discussed technology in the science literature, which is BECCS. I'm not sure everybody knows what that acronym is. So that's basically producing bioenergy, but using carbon capture and storage so that you're getting the negative benefit of using some kind of bio-based feedstock, but then connecting it with CCS to getting it to be a negative emission. In other words, less carbon on balance when you look at it on a life cycle way. And then I'll just end my comments with the point about this is that all of these systems, if we're really going to net zero, whether that's nations are going to net zero or corporations are going to net zero, verification is going to be the new science of the market. And that is because most of what people are doing today in the offsets market is not as sturdy to verification as it needs to be going forward and with changes. We're seeing companies like Microsoft, SAP, and Salesforce are using digital to develop automated carbon emissions tracking tools that will be used by companies and possibly governments. You have the EU and other governments pursuing satellite technology and other GIS, geospatial tools, so that they can verify not only their own emissions, but maybe the emissions of a global climate pact. And then we're seeing in the corporate space, we're seeing new organizations springing up like the Transition Pathway Initiative and the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which actually will help companies monitor, are they actually reaching the targets that they've announced? And the new thing, which we can talk about in our discussion, is the SEC, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, which oversees corporate disclosure, is proposing mandatory rules for climate risk disclosure. And the question is, as we start to get into this verification question, and we're going to have external parties with their satellites and so forth telling us whether a company is or isn't planting trees, and whether they are or aren't capturing their methane, and what their actual footprint looks like. Then I think this market for these solutions and the pricing for these solutions is really going to change. So I wanted to bring that into the discussion because that's sort of the new wave of ESG that hasn't quite hit the newsstands, as they say. It's not quite a purchasable product yet, but I think it will shape the next 5 years, especially after the Glasgow meeting is on the other side.
Excellent. Well, let's thank you for those remarks. I do want to come back to net zero in a moment, but I want to start a little bit more closer to home. You know, we've seen lots of fires in California. In fact, just UC Santa Cruz and the fires they've had in Santa Cruz have a real impact on our faculty and our staff and our students. And we've had calls as far as here in Oakland to find housing for members of our UC Santa Cruz community, all driven by fires and climate change impacts that we're seeing. So this is very real. And, you know, this morning, my daughter said, there's going to be more, as I was describing to her that you and I were going to chat, she said, well, you know, remember there's more plastic going to be in the ocean than fish in the foreseeable future. So there's a real issue both close to home and even far out around climate change. What do you see as the prospects for much stronger government action? Let's just even start with major economies to deal with these near to home implications of climate change.
Well, I think what's changed, I'll say the positive first, and then I'll put the caveat. So I think what's changed is people's understanding. Whereas in the United States, maybe less of this abroad, but across the world, and certainly in the United States, average people understand there's climate change. They can see the impact in their own lives. So in the United States, the polling is 70% of Americans think policy directed to address climate change is a high priority. That's a big change from the past, which was a more partisan issue. And I think that the other thing that I would point out that most people don't point out when you're talking about the climate debate is that we've seen government interfere in our daily lives all around the world to an extent that might have been completely unpredictable 5 years ago because of the pandemic. And that has been a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because while we're all sitting here having adjusted our lives, there's this big opportunity for governments to be more ambitious about how they address climate change and the rulemaking that could be imposed. And you're seeing countries that you might not have expected stepping up. Indonesia is talking about their new design for a carbon market. We're seeing governments in Africa reconsidering how to integrate more renewable energy into their development plans. We're seeing companies like Microsoft and others who previously bought offsets and told us not to worry about their data centers, now actually making a plan to place their data centers in a place where there is a lot of renewable energy, and they can be ensured they can tell their customers that 100% of this facility is being generated with clean energy. So we're seeing a lot of change, I think, and we're seeing more of a willingness of governments, I think, to consider how they're going to address the future energy system in their own countries. I think the challenge really, and we're seeing, the Chinese making the announcement at the UN that they will no longer finance coal as part of the BRI, Belt and Road, which is their export technology initiative. But I think the big problem that we're seeing, like right this minute, is that the physical appearance of climate change makes everything that much harder. Had we started 10 years ago, 20 years ago would have been even better, but had we even started 10 years ago, we would have more knowledge than we have now, where how to cope with drought, or how to ensure that there's enough water for the operation of nuclear plants, how to deal with intermittency of renewable energy. And we're starting to see real breakthroughs in technology. So people are talking about this new air iron battery that might be able to replace baseload power, to the scale of a coal plant through a battery storage solution that's long duration. We're seeing more discussion about hydrogen. I just finished a survey of the US midstream, so that's the US pipeline industry, and a surprising number of companies for a variety of reasons. Some person gave me this new term, he called it asset proofing. So, because they don't like the word stranded asset. So to make sure that these assets that they own will be part of the new economy, they're testing it for hydrogen blending, or they're coming up with hydrogen ready projects. Dominion has a very interesting project in Utah. We're seeing the state of California move forward on hydrogen in different aspects of both household and transportation use. So we're seeing, movement. But the flip side is, in many places that have had some kind of a heat wave or a drought or intermittency, we're seeing countries turning back to coal. And that's a serious problem. And it's a serious problem because with all the grandeur about the net zero announcements, including the US government, no one's emissions are going down.
So let's talk then about climate risk disclosures, because you're absolutely right. There's a lot of announcements, both in developed economies and also in developing economies. How do we hold corporations and countries accountable for the risk that comes from climate change in their business practices and the regulations that need to come as a result of that?
Well, I think, step one, step two, and step three is that big asset owners and other investors need to demand that government make disclosure of climate performance mandatory. That's step one. Has to be mandatory. This idea that somehow companies are going to voluntarily make announcements and there's going to be no verification system and no enforcement mechanism on those announcements, we can see is not working. PG&E, the California utility, did not disclose the percentage of its equipment that was not upgraded sufficiently to avoid creating fires in the state of California. If you were owning that stock, I might have told, Jagdeep, we should own the stock, but, someone who doesn't watch it closely and doesn't have the staff wouldn't have known to divest from PG&E before it went bankrupt. So that's a disclosure issue. For governments, we are going to get to the point where some governments are going to have the technology to actually know by big data how much coal is being used in a country, or what the scale of deforestation is in a country. And the question is really going to be, once we know and there's more transparency and diplomatic effort can be put to bear, our research at Climate Policy Lab really shows that it's not even just about cutting off the finance for some of these trends. It's that major reforms need to be made, in the electricity sector of different countries. Even here in the United States, we don't have proper regulatory pricing frameworks. We could see that in Texas last winter, where we just don't have the right formula for building responsive capacity markets, right? Backup systems for when climate risk affects the production of electricity. So there's a lot of work to be done that's in the regulatory sphere, not just in disclosures, but also in the electricity sector.
So it seems like net zero is the big announcement that every corporation or anybody that wants to sound smart about having a climate strategy is acknowledging as this is what we're doing and here's why we're the best company you should partner with. And candidly, I think it's just another fad term, starting with ESG a while back, and now it's net zero. I mean, we've been trying to strive for zero in fossil fuels, not net zero. Having said that, help the layperson understand what net zero means. And I know you've described it in a grid of different definitions, but is it just another, one of these made up marketing terms to capture attention? Who's really going to do something about net zero, and who's the leading example in your mind?
Well, I mean, I love that question. So I'm going to be controversial as always. I mean, a lot of talk about the term and not a lot of action. So, I mean, net zero is a scientific construct that was developed when we realized that we did not lower emissions, and we didn't lower emissions at all in the 90s and the 2000s. And so therefore, we're moving towards a 4-degree warming of the planet. And that's going to I mean, if you think about how catastrophic it is now with 1-degree warming, I mean, if there's someone listening to this that doesn't believe in climate change, which I doubt, but when somebody watches this in the webcast form and historically, if you're feeling uncomfortable in 1-degree warming, some parts of the world, maybe it's closer to 1.5 to 2 degrees, but in certain times of the year, but we're talking about an average of only 1-degree warming. We're talking about, if we don't do this quote unquote net zero, we could get to 4 degrees or higher. We're talking about just really catastrophic impacts. And let me just make this very clear. When the IEA, International Energy Agency, or oil companies, or other kinds of institutions do a pathway modeling to 2050, and they tell you that we're going to still be using oil and gas. The problem with those forecasts is that they assume that GDP growth will be the same in 2050 at 4 degrees warming than it would be if we don't do something, if we do something about climate change. And we know that that's not right, because we know that catastrophic climate events curb GDP growth. And we can see that this month in Europe, in China, in Africa, in the United States. We can see how the impact of climate change, fires, drought, lack of electricity, we can see how those things, flooding, affects GDP. So the idea that life is going to go on and global GDP is going to rise by 3% a year, ad nauseum over the next 4 decades as the temperature warms, this is a fallacious idea. The fact that it's embedded in all these energy models that tell you that we're going to have the same demand for oil or this or that, I mean, that is just not right, because demand's going to go down because we're going to not be able to travel and go anywhere and do anything, because we're going to be dealing with floods and fires and heat waves and so forth, right? So people need to wake up to that first and foremost storyline. That if I'm owning a company based on some forecast that they have to 2040 or 2050 that we'll still be using their product, that forecast is incorrect. That's step one. Step two is if you've actually announced you're going to do net zero, that means that you are committing to taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And then I have the question for you, which is, have you ever read a science article about how one would take carbon out of the atmosphere? What's your plan? And how would you verify it? If you plant a tree back in the Amazon today as part of your plan, or in Costa Rica as part of your plan for showing that you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, can you guarantee me in 2050 that tree will still be standing there? Can you really do that? Right? So a lot of these critical questions, we're just like making up stuff to gloss it over to make it look like we're doing something. And I don't have to say this at Santa Cruz. The consequence on real people of actually doing nothing is tremendous.
So now you got me going here. Okay, I was going to ask you about oil and gas, but I'm going to start with Bitcoin.
Okay.
So, and we'll come back to discuss the oil and gas industry and oil and gas investments, but the hottest topic is why aren't you in crypto? And all these arguments around crypto and energy use. Can you give us some perspective on that? I mean, is this, now that I'm listening to you, I could make the argument it's a bad ESG investment to be investing in crypto, thinking about the energy implications to society and the planet. What am I missing in that argument?
Hey, listen, you want me to come up with an anti-investment in crypto line of thinking? I mean, I can do it easily, because not only do I have to worry about the emissions from the data mining that I have to do, the centers that I need, and the energy consumption of that crypto, right? But, you know, just think cyber and resilience, okay? If there's a blackout somewhere, I have to know they got a backup system, right? I have to know it can't be hacked, which they say it can't be hacked, but, you know, I'm going to own it for not for just this year. You know, you're a pension fund, you're going to own it for 10 years. You know, are you sure that some technology to hack it won't be developed, right? Are you sure that the company you're investing in is going to be able to maintain electricity, right? I mean, to continue to provide the service. I mean, there's so many different elements that go to it between the security of it and the emissions of it. And then you have to decide on a policy basis. You know, the Chinese government has already made announcements about whether or not they're going to deem it illegal in China, right? So you have to wonder, you know, as we move forward. And my contention, you know, again, a big part of my book and all the book talks I've been giving, which was easier to do after Colonial Pipeline business systems got hacked, right, is as we digitize everything, you know, the consequences of cyber become so much higher. And all these digital technologies, whether it's an automated vehicle, whether it's your electronic banking, your e-commerce account, you know, whatever it is, you know, not only is all of that hackable, but it means that as a matter of national security, I have to be able to protect the bank account of my citizens. I have to be able to make sure that the sensors that Colonial Pipeline put in so they could automate their deliveries and billing don't result in the Pentagon not having fuel at the base in Virginia, right? So that means that governments are going to have to expend a tremendous amount of effort in the cybersecurity domain. We've already learned in horror in the United States how bad a job we're doing at it, right? And you know, these criminals, these sort of cyber gangs, whether they're cyber gangs paid by governments or just independent cyber gangs, that's a whole different, you know, webinar. But one has to imagine that if cryptocurrency is the means of choice to attack each other through cyber, then you're going to get a ban on it, because it's going to be imperative for international relations, détente, and national security in cyber.
Well, let's bring it then closer to data centers and the use of energy for data centers. And as you've been thinking about the sort of digitized energy future, This is an investment that we all think is absolutely high growth and the place to be with what has happened with the pandemic and the e-commerce world and the digital world we're living in. But they continue to be big users of energy. In fact, it's the biggest expense line for a data center is energy. What are some of the innovations or advances that you're seeing as companies are thinking about getting greener and cleaner and better at managing data centers in the future?
Well, how do we even come to having a battery storage technology business in California, Tesla and all these companies, right? We came to that because, I'm going to date myself, probably a lot of people listening don't remember even what Enron was, right? But, we had this innovative, natural gas company, Enron, which piped natural gas to California, tried to corner the market through some, not so great derivatives programs. And we had the California electricity crisis back in, the early 2000s. And what did the companies that had data centers then learn? I mean, you're running a data center, you can't have it go down even for 15 seconds. And so the companies themselves started investing in these new technologies. How could I have a backup system that can cut itself off from the grid when the grid gets disrupted and I still can know that my data center is going to have electricity? And so they did. They worked on different systems. Now we need to move to how to have those technologies be completely carbon neutral, right? And whether that's batteries, whether that's hydrogen as backup, there's no question that these data centers need to be all moved to renewable energy. And honestly, they're going to have to think about how independent are they going to be of the grid, right? I mean, there's a lot of interesting, new technologies for what we call mini grids or microgrids, where you're off-grid solution or you're connected to the grid, but you have an automated inverter that turns you off the grid the second there's going to be a disturbance. So that it doesn't, you can be independent. But the most important thing, Jagdeep, because people don't go down into the weeds, is that if somebody tells me they have a great plan for sustainable energy for their data center, I want to know, is the backup to cooling your battery a diesel generator? Because I want to know that, right? What is your backup system? Right? Because, we all, know from just this past year that all these backup systems that people say are going to work, some of them haven't worked and haven't worked at a critical time. So we need to really I think one of the things about net zero, and Microsoft, announced this recently, and you're going to see other companies do it. Ford, I think, is also moving in the same direction. So it's not just the ESG targets of my company, but everybody who's supplying me, I want them to be in the same environmental standard that I'm in, right? And I also want to know, post-COVID, are your supply chains secure, right? I mean, when you knew me in Davis, because PG&E is such a bad utility, the transformer in my neighborhood blew up. And luckily the fire was only on the transformer and didn't burn down my house, but it burned out my refrigerator. And when the repairman came and told me I needed a new circuit board, I asked him what that would cost. And he told me that I would have to buy a new refrigerator. Why? Because the circuit boards for Frigidaire were made exclusively in Fukushima, Japan. And thereby they had no alternative supply chain. So supply chain, supply chain, supply chain. Over the next 3 months, the word supply chain, which none of us pay attention to, is going to be on the front page every day for the next 3 months.
Okay, so let's talk about supply chain and inflation and oil and gas, because we are concerned about inflationary pressures. It may not be transitory because of supply chain issues. And one of the investment strategies that is promoted in an inflationary environment is to own commodities.
Right.
And let's break it down from commodities to oil and gas. So one of the questions that I have received whenever I speak to boards of other universities or those that want to hear about our journey around climate change and ESG is, Jagdeep, that sounds really smart, but why wouldn't you buy oil when it's cheap? And reality is, in the pandemic, it was minus $40.
Right,
And today it's $80.
right.
So the reality is, over those 2 points in time, oil prices have gone up. And the oil and gas industry is probably doing okay in terms of its market cap. So there is an argument to be made that oil and gas and commodities in the inflationary world due to supply chain disruptions are a good investment to have. How do we reconcile that if we were having this conversation and debate today, Amy, relative to 7 years ago?
Okay, so Jagdeep, you might know the other book that's not on my mantelpiece is my first book, which was called Oil, Dollars, Debt, and Crisis, The Global Curse of Black Gold. And that book really explained to people the fact that oil, but I'm sure this could apply to many commodities, are cyclical, right? And because we had this giant downturn in oil and gas in 2020, and because the cycle is shorter today, because shale can be brought online in a matter of months and doesn't take 5 to 7 years to bring on a new field, the cycle condenses. And so we're already feeling the upshot of having all the companies stop their drilling programs and having, investor community, private equity. Now all the private equity funds are calling me, oh, would you like to come on my board? We want to start a transition energy fund. And they basically can't find anybody to buy their energy fund if it has oil and gas in it. So the problem we face is twofold. There's a society problem, and then there's the investor problem. I mean, you and I have discussed in the past, there's going to be up cycles in oil and gas. And the question really is, is there some management out there that's so carefully investing in assets, maybe a hybrid company that still has legacy oil and gas, but they're pivoting to clean energy, like an Equinor or BP, right? And would it be worth holding those companies? Disclosure, BP is a funder at Tufts, but would it be worth holding equities in companies that are pivoting? Total is another company that's pivoting, right? Or is it more efficient for me if I'm worried that there's money on the table from the commodity cycle? Shouldn't I just be owning a commodity fund, right? I mean, I can just invest with a hedge fund that's going to move itself in and out of the commodity cycle. Well, not everybody can do it. A lot of companies lose a lot of money, so you have to really do your homework, right? But am I better off just owning a long short fund that'll move me in and out of the commodity to benefit from a short-term move? Because, the long-term vision of some of these corporate managements in the oil and gas space is not very thoughtful.
So pension funds and endowments like ours, for full disclosure, we haven't participated in what I'm about to describe, have just invested close to $15 billion in just 3 funds that are set up for what you just described as energy transition. So Mark Carney, of course, former governor of the Bank of England with Brookfield, has raised a $7 billion fund. Hank Paulson has raised a $5 billion fund with TPG. And there are others that are in the market doing similar things. I don't understand, what are they going to be putting money into? Can you help us understand what some of these energy transition assets are going to be?
It's a very interesting question. And then you have to ask yourself, well, who do I trust to make these investments for me? If you're a pension fund or a large institutional investor, who's going to make the judgment on, what to invest in? So for example, when I was preparing for this talk, I had read a really interesting piece about J.B. Straubel, the former CTO of Tesla, now has a metals recycling business. And I have to be quite honest, I ran to the NASDAQ, but it's not publicly trading yet. So, but there are going to be these interesting companies that might really be investable. But the question is, how large an opportunity is it? right? There's a timeline horizon. If I invest too early or I invest too late, I'm not going to get the benefit of that money. You know, do I want to be doing a co-invest in a technology? I mean, the great thing, of course, about being the UC is that you have a window into some of these technologies that maybe other investors don't have. But, you know, are there things that are early investables that I would want to take a flyer on, or is that too risky? You know, these are questions that a CIO has to ask when looking at these funds. And you know from your own experience, Jagdeep, when the Regents came to you and said, we'd like you to invest $1 billion in climate solutions, finding things that were really investable, but actually were going to return 7 to 10%. A little easier now than it was then, but you know, with everybody chasing the same, you know, 5 projects or whatever, you know, it's hard to find at scale investable options. And that's why I see some institutional investors investing alongside corporations in promising technologies, because the corporation brings the capacity to scale up, right? So that takes some of the risk out of, you know, whether or not you think a private equity manager is going to be able to position something in the market and then have it be able to scale up.
So let's think about hydrogen for a moment. It's also become one of the most attractive investment opportunities, and any energy company, no matter what renewable form they were in, has an announcement in the last, you know, 3 months that they're now a hydrogen company. And from there, I'd like to go for a moment to sort of the Biden administration as well. But let's start with hydrogen. How do you see, you know, where the genuine opportunities are in hydrogen, and what do those look like at the moment?
Well, you know, I mean, I'm a big believer in hydrogen. A lot of people are hydrogen skeptics. They think it's, you know, this is not the first time hydrogen's been hyped, but here's how I'm seeing the space. I'm counting on Bloomberg New Energy Finance's estimate that the cost for manufacturing electrolyzers is going to drop precipitously in the next 10 years. Right, and then you have to think about, you know, who will be in a position to utilize green electrolyzers, because they say that, you know, green electrolyzers, the cost of producing green hydrogen may actually be below the cost of doing methane and carbon capture and storage, which, you know, is the alternative, right? And even just what we do today, which is to just make the hydrogen from methane. So the opportunity, some of the opportunities that I think will be interesting, but they're not quite, like, there isn't a company you could grab, you know, maybe Plug Power, because they have some technology, but, you know, is going to be deep off water wind, right? So I'm going to, you know, what's the opportunity? Do I know of a deep water wind project that's going to have enough water availability to produce green hydrogen effectively? You've got some, you know, investable pilots in hydrogen in the United States. You know, Dominion has that Utah project that's pretty interesting. You have Europe has a sort of a blossoming practice in hydrogen, maybe for heavy transportation, possibly for heavy industry. You have to look at, you know, what companies are leading right now in the European sector could be interesting. So I think there's some early movers, and because there's so much interested in green investing, that can put wind behind your back. You know, if you were an early investor, Investis or Ørsted or some of those companies, you did pretty well last year. You know, Ørsted had that little hiccup with their cables in deep wind, but you know, still investors that put their money into some of those stocks were getting, you know, 200 or 300 times multiple of revenue, as opposed to investing in an oil company where you're getting 2 or 3 times the multiple of revenue.
So all of you watching this can actually Google a piece that Amy and I wrote this must be 2016, Amy, which was, what advice would you give to the next president? You might recall
Oh, yes.
we did a piece together. This was before, I guess, the last election. And here we are today, and this new president is doing a lot around infrastructure and climate change and energy and hydrogen and renewables. Well, what do you make of the Biden administration's policies? And how excited or not are you about the direction we're heading in? And how should we as lay people think about all these new buzzwords around infrastructure and climate change and energy from a government perspective?
Well, you might recall, Jagdeep, that in that piece, I think we talked about two things which I'm still huckstering to the current administration. One was to really enhance some of the programs that exist at DOE to help small businesses. When we go back and look at the SEVERE program, which is a DOE program to fund startup and small companies, innovation companies, and when I've just finished an analysis on the loan guarantee program, when we look at some of these federal programs, the smaller companies that get funded, it's proven very successful in launching those companies to be more successful, getting them past the valley of death, turning around, and the patent production of that public funding has been high. The employment and long-term stability of those companies has been high. Let's not forget that it was the US government that gave the first $400-something million loan to Tesla to build the Fremont factory. Now they have not only that factory, but they've got factories in Germany and China, and it's really one of the leading luxury electric vehicles. It's really paved the way to prove the electrical vehicle concept. So it might be even more important than the car itself, was just that it proved to people that it could be done and that people would like them. So, I really believe in public funding coming complementary to, makes it easier for someone like you, Jagdeep, to invest in some of these companies when the US government's there with a loan guarantee or there with assistance. And the other thing we talked about in that piece, which again, I'm writing about in different ways, is there's a lot of talk in this country about fairness. I've just done this analysis of the loan guarantee program. And, a lot of that money came to California, and that's great because California did a lot with that innovation money. But there are a lot of other states in the United States where people are suffering and they need retraining and they need businesses that can give them respectable and meaningful work. And the best way to do that is to make sure that this time around, the funding is spread evenly across the country. And that means enhancing the hubs that DOE puts into place with other universities and other kinds of economic centers to promote innovation. And innovation promotion is something the federal government should be doing across the country, and not just, Google thought they'd train 3 coal workers to do coding. We're talking about real innovation. I talked to a fellow who's been very successful, private equity groups, and very successful in Chicago. 50% of their founders are from minorities, people of color. And I asked them, how'd you do it? Right? Like, what was the way you did it? And I liked the answer they gave me. They said they went around to their ecosystem, they met people in their PhD programs, and they found young women and others who had interesting technologies that they wanted to launch, and they mentored them. And then when they got to the point where they had an early stage company, they invested. And they were proactive in going to universities that had diverse communities. And so, that's more work, but they told me that they have an unbelievably high success rate for the launching of those companies and making money that way. And I think that that's a paradigm we should be looking at, not only in the loan guarantee program, but some of the other DOE programs that help and launch new companies.
We're getting close to that 5-minute mark where we're going to have to wrap this up. And as most of you know, that Amy and I can go on for a while on this topic, but let's turn our attention to, I'm sure there are folks in the audience that are thinking, okay, as an individual, how could we either invest our own money in whatever companies might be out there, or as an institution, where are those exciting opportunities? And you've just spent all this time sort of writing about the digital future in energy, and hopefully a diverse and digital future in energy. Maybe that's the update to your book. But where would you suggest the exciting opportunities are today that, you know, we should be looking at?
Well, you know,
No stock tips, just no NASDAQ tips.
yeah, no NASDAQ tips. I mean, I think, because you mentioned crypto, I don't really like crypto, but I think, you know, I like recycling, metals recycling. I like early movers in fuel cells and hydrogen. I think that automation is a highly investable space. E-commerce has a lot more growth potential and is going to be important. So, I mean, there's a lot of excitement that's going to come. You know, the marrying of biotech and digital, also big potential. So, you know, read the book. No, just kidding. No, there's a lot of really exciting new companies. And I think that, you know, it's so hard to be optimistic sometimes when you watch the headlines in the news. But when you go and learn about the stories of the things that younger business people are doing, and the kinds of amazing solutions they're coming to, you know, hard pressed problems using digital technology, it can be pretty exciting.
Amy, it's always been fun for you and I to be talking to students across the UC system when you were here, and I'm sure you've continued to do that. What advice would you have for those students that aren't watching this today, but if somebody chooses to pick this up? You know, you've always been sort of providing words of wisdom to them as to how they should think about a new energy future, particularly our very active students that think we should be getting out of all the old energy forms. What's your updated version?
Here's my updated version. And for the students who I work with when I was at the UC, especially the Black Lives Matter students who were really ahead of the curve on solutions for better resources for community-based programs and less resources to private prison companies. Your activism's meaningful. You guide the debate about where we should be putting our attention, and it plays a very important function in society. You need to vote, and you need to be active about voting, and you need to be active about your freedom of speech. You need to be active holding social media companies responsible for the misinformation and disinformation they promote. You need to understand that with the freedom of speech comes the requirement to be factual and evidence-based in the things we advocate for, and to understand the science and to promote the science as you're active.
Thank you very much. I look forward to continuing these discussions with you personally offline. And for all of you, Amy is always a wonderful resource and accessible to have an intellectual debate with you on these very important topics. So congratulations on your book, and just keep doing all the great work you do. For all the audience that tuned in today, CAFIN will be having its next seminar on the 15th of October. We have Frederick Simana from Amundi, who's the speaker, and stay tuned and keep coming to these conversations on climate change organized by CAFIN and UC Investments on behalf of UC Santa Cruz. All right, well, have fun. Enjoy the rest of your week and weekend. Amy, talk to you soon, and thank you to the organizers. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much, Galina, and everybody. Bye-bye.